Assalamu alaikum students. Today we are going to discuss a topic which is impact of taxes, and for this purpose we are going to refer to unit 26.6 of IGCSE Economics. I'm just going to share my screen with you. So as you know that impact of taxes is a topic which is covered in unit 26.6 of IGCSE Economics. And let's begin with the fact that, as you know, taxation is one of the main sources of government revenue, in which there are two types of taxes. Typically, direct taxes are taxes imposed on income, and indirect taxes are taxes imposed on spending. Therefore, the indirect taxes are sometimes also referred to as regressive in nature. Today, to understand this topic, we are not going to talk broadly about different types of taxes, whereas we are going to stick more towards the fiscal policy measures, which are also referred to as the demand side policies in your IGCSE syllabus, because they use government spending and taxation to influence the aggregate demand in an economy, aiming to affect economic growth, inflation, and employment. As you can see on your screens, we have the image of two different scenarios reflected, which is with regards to the elasticity of demand of different products. Figure A shows a product which has an inelastic demand, which is usually the case of necessities, and figure B shows a graph which has a relatively elastic demand. Now, it's important to relate this topic with price elasticity of demand because it helps to build on the concept of incidence of taxation. Now, what does the word incidence means? Essentially, it means impact of taxation. The incidence of taxation refers to the distribution of burden of an indirect tax shared between consumer and producers. In the case of products with inelastic demand, consumer bears most of the tax. This is because the producer can pass on a high proportion of tax in form of a higher price, as they know it will not reduce the demand significantly. This is usually the case of necessities like sugar, flour, milk. All these products, no matter to what level the price go, we have to consume them on a daily basis. Therefore, producers know that the demand is somewhat inelastic. In contrast, if the products have elastic demand, it's the producers who bear most of the tax burden. This is because they know that they cannot pass on much of the tax to consumers as such, and a move would bring down the sales significantly. Figure 26.1 shows the contrasting impact of a tax on a product with inelastic demand and another product with elastic demand. In both A and B in figure 26.1, the tax shifts the supply curve to the left by the amount of the tax. The total revenue P1T XZ, the total proportion of tax borne by the consumers, is represented by the change in price multiplied by the quantity sold, that is P1TA. All right. Now, while direct taxes tend to be progressive, indirect taxes are regressive, and therefore they fall proportionally more heavily on the poor. And that is the reason they are called regressive in nature. Indirect taxes are also a useful source of income, especially in countries where it is difficult to raise much from the income tax, because a significant number of workers work in the informal economy. Also, in countries with low literacy, people might face problems while filing in tax forms. Okay, now I have reflected on the screen for you and past paper, IGCSE O Levels, October-November 2024 past paper. And this is the first question. I would not like you to spend more than 45 minutes attempting this question. This is a case study based question. So you can divide your time in such a manner that you spend about 5 to 6 minutes reading the case, quickly skimming through it, and then answering all the questions that you have, which are being reflected on the screen on the right side. In summary, the findings from the case study show a deficit in current account of payments. It also shows that the birth rate is higher than the death rate in Jordan. The labor force employment in tertiary sector is 79%. And there are several large renewable energy projects. Greater reliance on renewable energy, including wind and solar power. Some of the spending of Jordanian government is financed by borrowing. Other than this, in 2020-21, government is expected to increase the interest rate. And so after about spending 9 minutes, I have summarized these notes. Let's now move on to the questions. I'm going to start with the second part, B, which asks you identify two components of current account of Jordan's balance of payment. This is a 2-mark question. So you have to identify two components. One could be higher domestic demand, which is due to the economic growth leading to higher demand, and which in turn leads to increase in imports as consumers are and businesses buy more foreign products. Secondly, it could be that the country's exports are more expensive for foreign buyers. This reduces the demand for its products in foreign markets, decreasing export revenues, and it leads to a deficit. Now, part C asks you, explain the main type of unemployment experienced by Jordan in 2020. Now, first reason observing the case study could be that it starts because of or it stems from the slow economic growth due to Jordan's inability to create new jobs to absorb its high population growth and labor force from immigration. One reason. Secondly, poor infrastructure could limit job creation and hinder economic growth. Part D. Explain two advantages that Jordan's economy may gain from mergers between its tourism firm. Okay. One reason is that mergers have reduced the price of holidays, making it more attractive for tourism. It would lead to increased GDP. Mergers can also improve the financial performance of businesses through cost savings and increased revenues, which hints at economies of scale. Part E. Analyze the relationship between birth rate and average age. Firstly, it seems that Jordan has a young population, which means more people will be out and available in the country to do jobs. And the potential for the economy for growth is high because when more people will be employed, the output is going to be higher. However, it also puts pressure on the government to create jobs. And always the government has to also cater for the old age population as the death rate is less than birth rate in Jordan. All right. Now in part C, they've required you to analyze using a demand and supply diagram how an increase in population size will affect the market for clothing. So graphically, you can show this, that an increase in population size will shift the demand curve to the right. Producers will be willing to produce more on the higher price P1. Quantity supplied increases from Q1 to Q2, and it will lead to short-term inflation, which is also called demand pull inflation. Part G. Discuss whether or not the Jordanian government should spend more on renewable energy. Now, an increase in renewable energy will lead to increased imports, leading to further worsening of current account deficit. Second reason is that renewable energy sources are expensive to build, and some resources can be also deployed elsewhere. So students, you may have noticed that I have not spent too much time explaining and attempting to these questions because while attempting O-level exam papers, it's very important to divide your time equally between different questions. When you are attempting this question or similar questions in the exams, what you have to keep in mind that you time yourself appropriately and do not spend more than 45 minutes on the first question. Even if you feel that you have some additional points or elements that could build on to the argument, the exam paper is not the time to do that. You have to keep the marking scheme in mind. So I have also given screenshots of the solved solution. This is page 1, which gives you solutions. Firstly, summary of the case, which I did in order to have a kind of an analysis of the situation that Jordan is facing at the moment. And in next page, which is page 2, there is part D, C, E, F, and G. And part F shows the demand and the supply curve, showing an increase in population size, having an impact on the clothing market. So I hope students, you have enjoyed this lesson. I've tried to keep it short. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me in comments or you can email it to me and I'll be happy to connect with you. In the end, I would request you to please like and subscribe my channel. Thank you.